All right, folks, we are in week 4 of a 4-week sermon series. And the sermon series is called Walking the Talk. And it's really about how we begin to really think about breaking down the ways that we are called to live lives as disciples of Jesus. And when we think about those ways, it gets overwhelming quickly, quite honestly, because there's so many different ways, so many different types of ways of being a disciple. So when the staff and I got together and we're thinking about this, and I've been working on this project now for several years actually, and thinking about, could we break down the path of a disciple? Could we break down the discipleship process into kind of categories that would make sense as far as how to remember them, how to hold ourselves accountable to them, and things of that nature. And we came up really with 4 different areas. And they have been represented in circles, which you see on the cover of your order of worship this morning. And the circles basically, you see them here. So the first one we talked about 4 weeks ago, growing in faith, the green circle. Inside that circle you find things like worship and small groups, things that help us on a weekly basis grow in our faith, things that we basically have said in many cases are essential to our lives and a part of how we live out our faith. The second one that we talked about was discovering our purpose, and we talked about gifts and passions and interests, things like Mia was talking about just a little bit now. Where are those things that God has given us as things that we're good at or that we're passionate about, and how they intersect with needs in the world, and that may call us or show us a little bit more about where God is leading us to be particularly involved in paying special attention. Last week we talked about enriching our lives, which was sort of the hardest category to name. But in that, we think about all of the things that we do in the church that aren't necessarily the every week things, but the things that enhance or supplement, enrich the parts of our lives in the Christian experience. So things like, for example, a class on budgeting and saving, things like parenting, couples work, that kind of stuff. All of those things that sort of don't fit nicely in one of the other categories go there, but I think about them as sort of like the elective classes, the things that make up for a better, more well-rounded experience, but aren't necessarily the core of what we do. And today, the final circle, we round out with serving our neighbors, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But all 4 of these categories, I believe, are so important in pointing us to what it means to be a disciple. And if we want to take a well-rounded, holistic look at our lives as followers of Jesus, the goal would be not to find yourself in simply one of those circles, but to touch all 4 of them on enough of a regular basis that we feel like we are giving attention to all of those areas of our lives. There's going to be some that you're going to give more attention to. Those are going to weigh more in your life. But we want to get all 4 at least once every quarter or every year for sure, that we want to do that so that we are balancing our lives and doing things as Christians in all facets of our lives. And really, when I was thinking about where would we begin with a passage of Scripture that feels sort of all-encompassing for this series, this is the one I landed on, although there are probably several. Today's passage is from Romans. I'll be reading from the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 13. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function. So we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another with showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I'm struck by that first line. That first line, that the idea here is that in everything that you do, let it be worship or worshipful. It's poetic, for sure. It's a nice idea to consider, but hard to live into, hard to actually model. I think if we're honest, right? If we're honest, one of the things that we do is we compartmentalize our lives in so many ways, including sometimes the part that we say is the faith-based part, the Christian part of our lives. We set aside certain times of the day or of the week, like say Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. I'm going to devote that part, that sliver of my week to God. Even if we wake up and we begin our day in prayer or Bible study, there's still the sense for many of us that, well, we did that thing, that box is ticked, now we move on to the other parts of our life. But Paul in Romans 1, or Romans 12:1, basically the idea here is all of this life is God's. If it weren't for God, you wouldn't have the life that you have. And therefore, how are you going to live each and every moment, each action, each word, each thought, in such a way that it, in and of itself, could be worshipful to God? That's a different kind of perspective, isn't it? Quite honestly, it's pretty challenging. I like to think I'm a pretty decent person, but if I were to go over the last, say, 7 days, I'm sure I could think of things that I would like to say, yeah, that didn't count as worship, God. We're just going to put that out there and call that its own thing, and I'll let these things be the worshipful parts, right? But that's the goal. That's the goal, is to live into this discipleship kind of way of living. How will I live as a Christ follower? How will I, in the words of Genesis that we started the series with, how will I live as a God walker? How might we do that? So we've been looking at this question all 4 weeks now, and today we round out the series with this last circle: loving our neighbors, serving our neighbors. Remember when Jesus was asked, which is the greatest commandment? Jesus knows the answer that they're looking for. You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. And the second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what does it mean to serve our neighbors? In some ways, I think that if we're unpacking those 4 circles that you saw on the screen, the serving our neighbors is the easiest one to grasp, right? We can wrap our heads around that. We can think of all kinds of ways that we can serve our neighbors. Am I kind to them? Do I gather my next door neighbor's mail when they're out of town? Do we collect supplies to help people in need? Sure, it's all of those things. But my thinking around this had, I think, an important shift a few years ago as I was sitting in, of all things, a meeting in the North Alabama Annual Conference. And the question that came up was, what is the right way to serve our neighbors? And the people that were bringing forth this idea were a special group that was set aside and charged with this goal of being in ministry to the poor. And so we have a special committee in the North Alabama Conference of the United Methodist Church called Ministry to the Poor. But the change of mindset, I think, happened when that group came in and they challenged the thinking around that and said, what if it's not as much ministry to the poor as it's ministry with the poor? And that simple word change shifted at least my perspective, and I think that of many others, about what it means to truly serve our neighbors. So if you think about it, I guess I came around to the idea that I think it's important to serve the poor, or serve people in need, serve our neighbors, when we're talking about things that are for them and with them. It's not one or the other, it's a both and type thing. It's important, for instance, that we collect diapers, that we will join with thousands of others in Alabama to contribute to Bundles of Hope, that ministry that is a diaper bank ministry, by the way, which was started out of United Methodist Church in Vestavia. But the idea there is that we're going to do something for somebody, right? We're going to donate diapers. They're going to disappear in a warehouse, and somebody is going to get them that needs them. We have supplies in the back of the room that we have collected over the summer where we are going to assemble flood buckets, which are buckets of materials that go to people when they have experienced a natural disaster and they're going to need immediate cleaning supplies and things of that nature. If we had our buckets assembled right now, I have no doubt that some of them would be going to Jackson, Mississippi this week because of what they're experiencing. So those are great examples of ministries for people in need. Those are ministries for our neighbors. And those are absolutely essential. Those flood buckets are needed. The diapers are needed. Rise Against Hunger is food to people who are going to need it. And they are going to avoid starvation in some cases because those meals go for those people. But as a church, as the church, we also need to remember the ministries with our neighbor. And I want to share a little bit about that today because I think that that's a harder one sometimes for us to grasp. Now, ministry with somebody looks different, doesn't it? With implies the idea that you are going to be building a relationship, that this is not a one-off kind of event or opportunity. It means that there's going to be trust that builds in that kind of relationship. It means that there is going to be accountability in that relationship. In fact, there's a ministry that you'll hear more about this fall here in Birmingham, a United Methodist ministry, that the whole idea is you don't get to come down here and help us in our neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon for 2 hours and then walk away. Instead, you're going to come down here and you're going to worship with us. You're going to eat meals with us. And once we have this trusting two-way relationship, then we can work alongside of each other, not for the benefit of their neighborhood, but our community. This is just a different way of thinking about this, right? This is a good idea. It's like when I think about mission work, there's the kinds of mission trips where you can go paint a house and then come home, and then a year after that you can go to a different part of the country or a different part of the world and do it again. That's important. It's a great introductory level kind of way of being in ministry with our neighbors. But it's a different thing if you're going to commit to a particular community, a particular household, a village, and go back there and say, for 5 years, we're going to continue to be a part of a shared story. That's a different way of thinking about things. Jesus did both, didn't he? Jesus' ministry was a ministry to and a ministry with. There are times that are one-off things. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, heal me. I will heal you. Your faith has made you well. Never to be heard from again. He also takes these 12 under his wing, says, let's do ministry together. And through that experience, you have disciples that then go on to start the church. The church. The church is not started off by a one-off, I helped you on a Saturday afternoon ministry. It's the investing in, it's the pouring into, it's that life-changing stuff on both ways that makes a big difference. This week I actually heard from the chair of the Council of Bishops. So this is like the person who is temporarily elected to be the leader of the cabinet of the bishops, or the Council of Bishops that we have in the United Methodist Church. And he was talking about just this very thing. And the examples he was talking about in ministries with our neighbor, his examples in this story came out of the West African nation of Sierra Leone. Now, Sierra Leone, 20 years ago, thanks be to God, their civil war finally ended. It was one of these particularly awful wars with the conflict had so many atrocities and violations of human dignity and rights and inhumane things that were happening. It was a spillover from a war in Liberia that spilled into Sierra Leone, and there was conflict over money and control over the diamond industry and just a desire for power. And so many of these young pre-adolescent boys were enlisted into military service, and it was just one of the most horrible things that we've seen in the world in the last 20 years. And out of that came a nation that was in incredibly bad shape. Number one in lowest life expectancy. Number one in poorest nation on the planet. Number one in maternal mortality, so women dying during childbirth, right? These things were there. And then in 2014, they were at the epicenter of the Ebola outbreak that happened at that time. So many things were not going well, and the United Methodist Church said, let's focus our attention there right now. And one of the things that the church decided it could do was, because of the low life expectancy, they said one of the biggest problems after the war is over is malaria. And malaria is, by and large, pretty preventable. There are some basic things that you can do to help eradicate malaria in your community, or if people do get malaria, ways to treat them. But in a nation that has so little resources, this was a major challenge. And so the Methodist Church says, I got it. We're gonna do a campaign, and it's gonna be called Imagine No Malaria. And we're gonna make sure that we give away millions of bed nets, these nets that go over people's bed at night so that mosquitoes can't infect them with malaria while they sleep. And it was a great success if success was, how many nets can we leave in Sierra Leone and walk away, right? What they found was people went back to go check up. How's the net campaign working? Well, they found people fishing with the nets. They found people that gathered up supplies and slung them over their back in their net and carried it like a backpack, right? And there was a whole lot of great net usage, just not being over beds and not helping much with malaria. So they said, okay, this wasn't a bad idea. We just need to change our approach. So this time they enlisted a whole bunch of people. And they said, here's the plan. We're going to go into all of these villages. We're going to stay for a while. We're going to get to know them. We're going to worship with them. We're going to have meals with them. We're going to establish some trust. And then we're going to ask if we can go into their homes, and we're going to hang the bed nets for them and show them how to use them, and show them first how they can do it for their kids, and then how they can do it for themselves. Bingo. The change started to happen. The malaria number started to drop. Things started to improve. Life expectancy became a little better. I'm not saying it was because of the bed nets, but even poverty rates improved a little bit. And it attracted more attention. The United Nations came in and said, that was a really cool strategy. Can we learn from you? Yes, you can. Bill and Melinda Gates said, hey, that's kind of neat. Can we contribute? Yeah. Then the National Basketball Association said, how about if we do it again and call it Nothing But Nets, and we try this again and push even further? And we're like, yes, please, right? Today, the United Methodist Church is the third largest educator of children in Sierra Leone. And that wasn't the case just a few years ago, before we began doing ministry with our neighbors, and when it was only about doing something and walking away and feeling like we had done a good job. It's a both and, but you got to have the both. Bishop Yambasu was the bishop of Sierra Leone until 2 years ago, just about 2 years ago now, and he died in a car accident. But he told the story before he died that there was a group of community leaders. And much of Sierra Leone is a Muslim country. And so these leaders, community leaders, came to the bishop's office and they said, we have a request from you. And the bishop said, okay, how can we help you? And they said, we would like you to start more churches in our communities. Let me get this straight. You want us to plant more churches, and you are asking for this in your communities. That's right. Cool. Why? And this verbatim is what they told him. You showed us that you cared for our bodies. Now we want you to care for our souls. If we're looking for examples of how we can make a transformative difference in any community, on the other side of the world or our own. We need to think about what it means to truly serve our neighbor. And it's things like one-time collections, it's giving to special requests, it's providing relief when there's a natural disaster. But it's also the kinds of things that establish meaningful, lasting relationships, building trust, creating inroads. Yes, this is a great story of the connectionalism that we are all a part of in the United Methodist Church. But it's also an example of one thing that can be done that ends up changing lives, changing communities, changing culture, changing souls. It's a part of what we need to think about when we are living into our mission here at Grace, of strengthening families by making and growing highly committed disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Where does that begin? In large part, that begins with serving our neighbors. And how do we do that? We do things for them, and we do things with them. And together we might model for them what Christ and his disciples modeled for us. Will you pray with me?